Hello everyone. So today I want to give you an introduction to our group studies in the book of Luke. So I'm first going to start with a brief overview of Luke and Acts. Now, Luke's gospel is unique in so many ways, but one of those ways is that it's the only gospel with a sequel. Woo! And pretty much all scholars agree that Luke and Acts were written by the same person, and most agree with tradition, and that it was written by Paul's travelling companion, Dr. Luke. Now that tradition is bolstered by the fact that Irenaeus claimed Lucan authorship early in the 2nd century, and he was a student or disciple of Polycarp, who was a contemporary of the Apostle John, who knew Luke. Add to that, Eusebius, the great 3rd century historian of the church, never suggested an alternative writer of Luke's gospel, even though he was perhaps best placed to provide one. An argument from silence, perhaps, but it is a strong one. One commentator, by the way, cheekily notes that Luke is the gospel of food, since he mentions eating more than the others. Regardless, many agree that Luke's is definitely a gospel of singing and of much joy. So who was Luke? There is some discussion amongst theologians and academics as to whether Luke had perhaps been among those early disciples, maybe even one of the 70 mentioned in the Gospels. Though this actually seems quite unlikely, a far more plausible scenario unfolds if we take it that Luke was from Antioch, probably a part of the church there which sent Paul and Barnabas off on their missionary journeys. He was either a Greek or a Hellenistic Jew. If the former, then he is the only Gentile to have contributed to the New Testament, and he wrote over a quarter of it. Now, there are 3 occasions where Luke gets a mention in other parts of the New Testament, and from these we learn that he was a doctor. And that completely makes sense, because some of the terminology he uses to describe the illnesses Jesus heals are more normally found in the medical writings of that time. Perhaps because of his medical training, being used to questioning patients to work out what was wrong, he compiles some really insightful and accurate information, which lead many to realize that his gospel is a well-researched historical document. Luke was also credited at one point in history, around about the 8th century, with being an artist. Now, whilst I love the notion of Luke actually painting some of the early church characters, this story actually has no facts to back it up. But it is probably the reason why in some quarters he is known as the patron saint of artists. So, thirdly then, what was Luke's intention for his gospel? Well, Luke himself leads us straight into his intended purpose. He wants this book to give believers an accurate chronological understanding of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Luke thoroughly investigated Jesus' life by speaking with the eyewitnesses, as he notes in Luke 1 and verse 2. Now, he gives the name Theophilus, and by extension us, a clear and detailed record of the things that Jesus did and said. Now, whilst this Theophilus could well have been a specific person that Luke had in mind as he wrote, and because he calls him most excellent Theophilus, it could very well be that Theophilus is someone of high social standing. Nevertheless, since the name means one who loves God, many have seen it almost as a writing device, which then frames the whole of Luke and the book of Acts as being written to the group of believers who were growing in their faith, and also those who would yet come to believe by looking into these things. And so we take it that Luke is written to Christians with only a little education in the life of Christ, making this book a terrific starting point for believers interested in studying his life today. Luke's undeniable purpose in writing this gospel and the sequel of Acts is to demonstrate to all that God is working his purpose out. He shows us from the outset that God had long ago laid plans and, in the fullness of time, brought them about through the birth of Jesus. Jesus is thus rooted in a lengthy salvation history from Adam right through to the day of Luke's writing. And we go on to read in Acts, it continues on into the life and witness of the church. And therefore we, you and me, are a part, an ongoing part of the story, that great salvation story. So whilst Luke is writing a deeply theological treatise in his gospel, it is important to realise that Luke's language and style is of the highest quality in the New Testament. More importantly, his historical record is accurate. And those who would wish to cast doubt on his writing because of the miraculous nature of the content, nevertheless must also deal with the fact that his is a well-researched and historically rich writing in keeping with the highest standards of the time. What I like is the fact that he has sought out those whose lives were impacted from the life and ministry of Jesus and has captured their words. So, for instance, who better to talk about the events of the birth of Jesus than his mother Mary, who was probably living in or around Ephesus at the time that Luke was doing his research, and she was being cared for probably by the Apostle John. Now, whilst Luke doesn't credit his sources directly, he notes that he has sought out the eyewitnesses of those events to get the first-hand details. And from these, he crafts his books. Now, if, as many think, Luke was a non-Jew, then this really does have the flavour of him writing as an outsider looking in, an observer of God's great human experiment, who is recording the impressions and the results in detail. He's aiming to be a faithful reporter of the events which had impacted and changed the lives of so many up to that point. And he's thus giving other outsiders the opportunity to look on and consider these things for themselves. Fourthly then, when and where did Luke write his book of Luke? Well, sadly there's a lack of certainty on both things, but what is understood by most scholars is that Luke had to have been written before the book of Acts, and Acts, from his own internal narrative, had to have been written around the point just after Paul's demise in Rome. So it's thus likely that Luke was written in the early 0060s. And there's much more scholarly debate to be had on when, to be fair, but the majority verdict does tend to sit in that approximate time frame. And we're not given the where either. Luke gathered much of his information from those living in and around the Holy Land. He also had a lot of information at his fingertips from travelling around with the Apostle Paul. Since Luke is thought by many to have come from Antioch, then there's a wealth of options for us. The likely writing spots include Antioch, Achaia, Caesarea, Troas, perhaps even Rome itself. The truth is, whilst we can speculate where Luke wrote his gospel, it really has no bearing on the content of the writing. As an aside, there are certain stylistic similarities in the language of Luke and Acts and the books of Timothy and Titus, and obviously we've just been studying Timothy. But that leads some commentators to believe that Luke was not only a travelling companion of Paul, but it was also one of those amanuenses, the ghostwriters, who wrote down the thoughts and words of the apostle. Now that remains conjecture and cannot be proven one way or the other. But you know what? It's a really nice thought that maybe the good Dr. Luke and his old friend Paul would work together in this way. Fifthly then, what about the content? How is this different from and how is it similar to the other Gospels? Because Luke is one of the three synoptic Gospels, and synoptic means from a similar viewpoint. And it shares a lot in common with Matthew and with Mark, drawing on some common sources. Now, as an aside here, scholars and academics would enter into a very lengthy discourse at this point about the existence of oral traditions and the likelihood of them being combined with the book of Mark to provide sources for both Matthew and Luke. The discussion would then go further to postulate how there possibly are other long lost sources written down somewhere. And it's a fascinating study to make, to be fair. But we won't get bogged down by it here, since none of it casts doubt on the content of what really is an excellent and well-written gospel. Certainly as a result, Luke is the longest of the Gospels, and it includes a lot of additional content. For instance, Mark jumps straight in to the beginnings of Jesus' ministry. Matthew starts with a genealogy, but Matthew's is shorter than Luke's and only aims to show Jesus' royalty. Luke's genealogy deliberately traces Jesus right back to Adam. Why? Because Jesus is the Saviour of all nations and peoples, Jew and Gentile alike, totally in keeping with his main purpose, which we touched on earlier. Luke also has more detail around the birth of Jesus and uniquely shows us a couple of cameos of Jesus as a child. Since we are beginning this series in January, you'll probably have heard quite a lot about what Luke has to say around those things. So sixthly, let's have a look at a more detailed breakdown and perhaps the highlights of the book of Luke, which look something like this. The first 4 verses detail Luke's introduction and his purpose in writing to us. To set the scene, Luke then relates the story of the births of John the Baptist and of Jesus, and that's continuing on in chapter 1 through to the end of chapter 2 and verse 52. Already we see Luke is embedding the story in the longer salvation arc of the people of Israel, but set to the backdrop of all peoples. Then, as these infants become adults, we now experience John's ministry and the preparation of Jesus' ministry, and that's chapter 3 and verse 1 through to chapter 4 and verse 13. And as Jesus is then released to do his work, we see him first on tour around Galilee, and it is filled with incredible teaching combined with hugely significant miracles. And that's from chapter 4 and verse 14 through to chapter 9 and verse 50. Inevitably, Jesus is drawn towards Jerusalem, continuing his teaching and his working of miracles. And that's from chapter 9 verse 51 through to chapter 19 and verse 27. We then get a close-up in a couple of chapters which zoom in on Jesus' ministry whilst in Jerusalem, and that's from chapter 19 and verse 28 through to chapter 21 and verse 38. But matters come to a head, resulting in Jesus' passion and the events leading to Jesus' crucifixion. And that's from 22 verse 1 through to 23 verse 56. And these are iconic moments for us to savour and to leave us holding our breaths, wondering what's going to happen next. Finally, at least for the first installment of Luke Acts, we get to experience a front seat at Jesus' resurrection and ascension. And that's chapter 24, verse 1 to 53. And of course, at that point, we can breathe just a little bit. Now, in our groups, we're going to be tackling Luke over 6 video sessions where various teachers in the church will bring a highlight from a section of Luke. We're going to divide it up into 6 roughly equal sections, though we note that the content is paced differently in each section. Now, as with Timothy, I would totally encourage you to read the whole book in a single session at least once. This is an incredible story, told with a voracious appetite for detail, and it will leave you breathless and awaiting part 2. God bless you.